Hey everybody, I'm Eddie Starr, and this is the College of Rock and Roll Knowledge. Class is now in session. This is where the music and culture that shaped a generation live on, and my own path through the world of rock and roll.
Hey, Eddie.
Hey.
How are you, man?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I think I got to turn my volume up just a little bit. So how are things at the College of Rock and Roll?
Oh, they're always groovy.
Cool, man.
And it's great that you're here.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, one of the things I was really interested in speaking with you about was your memories of music growing up. And that had to do with a story you had once told me about a friend of yours who had the biggest and best record collection. And I thought, first of all, though, going back a little bit, do you have any memories of like music as a kid and what you were into? Or
Well, it's I have thousands of memories of music as a kid. And I know you call this a College of Rock and Roll. But I think of it more broadly, kind of as pop music, because as a kid, my first experience that I can remember of music as a kid was my cousin Francine. So Fran was a pom-pom girl at John Jay High School in Brooklyn, but she was the cool kid, the cool cousin, because she smoked cigarettes. And she drove around when she got a little older. She drove around in this like aquamarine Studebaker. And some of your audience might not remember Studebakers, but that was an American car company back when there were more than three. So I remember being with Fran, and she had this case of 45s. And we would go up to her house, and she would play these 45s. And I can't specifically, I remember hearing Pat Boone and probably Paul Anka and Chubby Checker, but I can't specifically remember the songs, but that's my first memory of music and listening to music. But of course, you're also affected in your household by your parents. So the radio would be on in the morning. You'd have to, it's freezing cold on winter mornings when you get up, and they didn't send heat up at night back then. I don't know what they did, even though my grandmother owned this little building that we lived in. And I remember hearing, you always heard, one of the huge hits back then was Roger Miller's King of the Road, which is a great song. I know you're familiar with it. That was a great song. And then you'd hear things like, I remember this crazy song by the Statler Brothers, which was Flowers on the Wall,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know.
You remember that?
Well, I don't remember it, but I guess for me, I can say like as a Generation Xer, there's that sort of in-between thing where for me, a lot of the music that I heard as a kid was stuff, of course, like you're talking about that your parents played. And so I do remember hearing my dad play that on the radio. And it's sort of funny that you brought up Pat Boone, because my dad was very much into his parents' generation of music. So Pat Boone for him was like, he liked him and Frank Sinatra and stuff like that. But
Frank Sinatra. I was just going to say, Frank Sinatra was always a presence. I mean, no matter what generation you were in, there was such a power of his singing, of his music. I mean, he was always a presence.
Yeah.
I think no matter what generation.
Yeah, I remember.
And well, go ahead. You were going to say
I'm
something.
just laughing about that song. I also remember it was in Pulp Fiction too.
Was it? I don't remember that,
I
but
remember,
it
I
was
think it was Bruce Willis's character, and he's like
crazy.
counting flowers on the wall.
The wall,
Yeah.
playing solitaire
Yeah.
too long with
Yeah.
a deck of 51.
Yeah.
Smoking cigarettes and watching
Watching
Captain
Captain
Kangaroo. Now
Kangaroo.
don't
Yeah.
tell me you got. To me, it was the most depressing song I ever heard. Um, and the other thing was my mom. I don't know where she got this from. My mom was a wonderful woman, single parent, and she was determined to expose us to quote unquote culture. So she would always take us to museums. And the other thing she did is she would take us to Broadway shows. Now, we didn't have much money. So when I say we, my mom and my brother, so we would sit in the top balcony, at these Broadway shows. But I saw like The Music Man, The Sound of Music, Oklahoma, my sister Irene. I just saw all these Broadway shows as a little kid, and it sticks with you. And then she used to play the record albums on our phonograph. So you'd hear Some Enchanted Evening from, South Pacific, or you'd hear,
Yeah.
Everything's Up to Date in Kansas City, all these like things that ordinarily who would be exposed to that? And yet all of those songs kind of, spun through my mind. And so I'm trying to take you through this sort of chronologically in my life, because one of the biggest impacts on me in terms of music, and I think of the country in terms of music, was Ed Sullivan. I
Wow.
mean, it's right.
Yeah.
I know we're different generations,
Well,
but
that sort of I mean, Ed Sullivan, that sort of transcends, you know, his impact. I mean, everybody knows, of course, Ed Sullivan and all the power he had to really, break an act.
yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, every Sunday night we gather around the television, black and white television, of course, and and you'd watch Ed Sullivan, and then you'd watch Bonanza. I always wondered what Bonanza must have looked like in color because all he had was a black and white television. Um, and Ed Sullivan had this huge impact. I remember the first time I saw the Beatles was on Ed Sullivan. I mean, that was just a revolution. And every kid then went to a mirror and combed their hair down to look like the Beatles. And they say, I want to hold your hand. And you can't underestimate the power, or I should say the impact, the social impact of the Beatles, because they were more than a musical act. For whatever reason, even back at the beginning, they were a social phenomenon. And as they went on and became rather social revolutionaries, it just changed the whole psyche. They were a very big part of the psyche of the 60s revolution. And I was never a huge Beatles fan, but later on, I guess my favorite album of theirs was Sergeant Pepper's. I mean, it was it's just earth shattering. And it's so amazing to me. But through Ed Sullivan, you got exposed to the Supremes, to Marvin Gaye, to Sam Cooke, you name it, the Stones. I mean, everybody, you always waited who was a musical guest on Ed Sullivan.
How did that translate for you at school? You know what I mean? In terms of what other kids were listening to and
Um, you know, I don't know if this is a coastal difference, West Coast, East Coast. But for me, school was not a place where, I don't know, you experience music a lot. Um,
Oh,
I went to, it's very interesting because, well, my first year of high school, I went to New Utrecht High School in Brooklyn. And you were just hoping to survive. I mean, it was it was kind of a tough school. And then I moved to Queens and went to Newtown High School in Queens, which was supposed to be a tough school, but really wasn't. But the thing is that that was during the baby boom, and schools were, they just didn't have enough room and capacity for schools. So you just went to school to go to school. We went to school like 5 hours a day. There was split sessions. Either you went from 7 in the morning till 12 noon, or you went from 12 noon to 5 o'clock. So there wasn't a lot else that went on besides school.
they didn't like
Um,
other kids didn't talk to you about music or your friends or
well, friends are a different thing. So, but before I even get to my friend Leslie, who you mentioned, it's it's like up till a certain point in time, it just seems to me that I was aware of music. I like music. I love music, but there's nothing I consciously sought after. It was just always there and around me. And then, there are these really marked moments in your life, sometimes with music. And it was the late 60s. And I flew out to Ohio to visit my brother, who was going to Ohio State University. Not a good fit for him. And he left after his first year. But I was visiting him, and I guess not knowing any better and being a kid, I don't know if I was 16 or whatever, and he was a couple of years old, and we went hitchhiking up to Canada to camp out at this park called Point Pelee or Pelee Point or something. And coming back, I was going to fly out of Detroit and sitting in this coffee shop in Detroit. And it's not a name you would associate with Detroit, but the radio was on, and suddenly I heard this voice singing and this song, and I was so um, taken over by it. And I said to my brother, "Who is that?" And he said, "Oh, that's Bob Dylan. You never heard of Bob Dylan?" And I said, "Oh, of course I did, but somehow that day, that song, in that moment of my life," and he was singing a song that might be somewhat obscure to a lot of people called Positively Fourth Street or Fourth Street. Um, and it just resonated with me. And when I got back to New York, I just had to put my hands on every Bob Dylan album I can get my hands on. So, and I just started listening to everything I could from his very first album through, and I used to go down to the East Village. There were these record stores in the East Village where, you can buy bootleg albums, which were unreleased tapes that they would produce onto vinyl. So I had the basement tapes 20, 30 years before anyone, before they were actually produced on albums, and all kinds of his stuff that nobody ever heard, including just telling stories. You hear him telling stories, and the death of Emmett Till, which I think that was released later, way later on. So I became a huge Dylan fan. And what was interesting, okay, so we go back to Ed Sullivan for a moment, and you hear the Animals do the House of the Rising Sun, which is like, wow, you know? And then I buy the very first Dylan album, which I think was just called Bob Dylan. And he has an incredible version of the House of the Rising Sun on it, which he later credits the arrangement to a folk singer from the 50s by the name of Dave Van Ronk. And it's just, if anyone wants to go back and listen to it, it's just an incredible version of House of the Rising Sun. So I became a huge Dylan fan. And it's around that time that I really, that music became more of a conscious kind of thing. And there was my friend Leslie. And Leslie looked a lot like Leslie West. People used to say, hey, Leslie West, you know?
From the band,
And
what
Leslie
was it called? The Mountain, right? Was the
Mountain.
band
And
called
then,
Mountain?
yes, the band was called Mountain. And then he got together with the guys from Cream. They had Wes, Bruce, and Lang, who did a whole bunch of great music. And Leslie was a great guy. Leslie Martell, not that might, who knows, there might be someone out there who knows Leslie. And Leslie, you know, we all went to high school together, but Leslie dropped out of high school. And Leslie had his electric guitar, and he had a room filled with shelves of record albums. He must have had 500 record albums. And you'd come around to where he lived, and, you know, you kind of pinged his window with a little pebble, and he'd look through the blinds. You'd come around and he'd buzz you in, and you came into Leslie's house. And he had this great black Labrador retriever called Duke. And Duke would come to the door and bark, and he'd be like, I always felt he should have had a white bow tie because Duke was like the butler of the house, you know. And then you go into Leslie's room, and he would just be spinning records. I mean, you know, he'd always have the latest of anyone who is out there, anyone from the Doors or Jethro Tull or Janis Joplin to Gary Puckett and the Union Gap. I mean, it was just the broadest expanse of music. And that's where I listened to a lot of music, and his tastes were so eclectic that you were exposed to everything. So that was, that was a fascinating time. Everything, and then, I mean, music was just exploding, late 60s, early 70s. You had the Doors, you had Janis Joplin, you had Carole King, you had Cat Stevens.
Yeah, Tapestry. That was like one of my mom's favorite records. She loved that.
Yeah.
album.
Yeah, it's an incredible collection of her works. She was really.
How did that? I guess that whole time period, was it? There's the whole like idea of stories that are told about that time period in music. With like the Jefferson Airplane. And Dylan and Joan Baez and all those people. During that time, do you think those stories or the whole idea of it really what was like it is told, like today when people talk about it or the press talks about it?
Well, the one real similarity and connection in music in recent times and music back then, and maybe music always, is that music has always been inextricably linked to social revolution, to what's happening in the society. I'm not sure that's quite so true today, but it certainly was when rap and hip hop arrived on the scene. And it certainly was then. I mean, social revolution and music and social revolution in the 60s and early 70s are one and the same almost. I mean, so much of the music was protest.
Yeah, but I mean, you think about, for instance, I was reading, like over time, stories, excuse me, it's like that game of telephone,
Mm-hmm.
where, by the time you get to the back of the room, the story is completely changed.
Sure.
And for instance, I was reading, someone was talking about the whole punk thing and, in the mid 70s, and someone was saying, oh yeah, that was, a social revolution. And, Johnny Rotten, or, he was like, we were just really just bored and just trying to be provocative. So you have a lot of sometimes, people look back at it different. And, I was just curious because you have that, as someone, I did not see the Beatles. Obviously, I was not here then, but, for me, listening to, like, my parents always listened to the station in LA called KRLA, and they would play all the oldie songs. So a lot of my really early childhood memories or music that really sort of caught my attention, I think I sort of fell in love with a lot of the ideas of the stories that came out about the Stones, not so much, I would say somewhat the Beatles, but, my mom loved the Stones a lot. And so I had that sort of really basic rock and roll idea. So when other things were coming out in the 80s, new wave, and a lot of that stuff, I sort of, gravitated to that sort of basic rock and roll idea. But it was a lot of the stories that really caught my interest, like the stories about the LA scene. I'd read in Cream magazine or Rolling Stone, and they had these really, you see these people and they really looked like, like superheroes or just, and the stories were so provocative, and, I wanted to be like them. That idea, a lot of people did, a lot of the kids,
Mm-hmm.
at least this is mid 70s, and I was in grade school, and kids would bring 45, and this is Southern California, of course, it's not New York. But so I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like the Beatles, who they were back then when they were starting out, and the fandom and the
Mm-hmm.
hysteria, and, and the Rolling Stones. Do you think the stories their story that is told now, do you think it reflects what it was like being there? And, like when you saw them on Ed Sullivan, obviously they were just a new band. They weren't like,
Mm-hmm.
the legends they became. But when people talk about that time period, do you think it was really like what they were talking about, uh, they talk about now? Am I making myself clear? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I sometimes
Yeah.
have a hard time getting it out, but
Except, you know, I guess our experience, I mean, you're a musician, I'm not. You're a performer, I'm not.
but I mean, that
So,
doesn't make any difference though, Marshall. I mean,
okay.
I just want to know, like, like now when they write about the Beatles, right? For instance, and they say,
Mhm.
oh, Ed Sullivan, and it was a whole, it was a revolutionary moment. But when you're sitting there watching, at 10 years old or whatever, and you're looking at Ed
Right.
Sullivan, it's not a revolutionary moment. You know what I mean? It's just a new band on TV. So I just was curious about how that
I have
time.
to say this. You
Yeah.
know, there's a few things that run through my mind here. So, first, I have to say this. When the Beatles first appeared, even at 10 years old, and I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, I don't know why or how, but it changed something in your brain. There was, and it wasn't that. I mean, the music was cute then. They weren't like, making great music. It was cute. It was sweet. But there's something about the whole phenomenon changed your brain, changed your perceptions. Um, but then when you ask about the scene, I guess, you know, for me, I was never so interested about, oh, who are these people? and what are they doing? What, you know, and I don't want to say my generation, but for me, what you wanted to emulate, or what you daydreamed about emulating, was being the voice of these, not only these extraordinary communicators of spirit and soul and intellectuality and poetry, but you emulated wanting to be the voice of change, of revolution, of, I mean, what they represented was very powerful. Um, so yeah, so it was something different. You think of a Nina Simone, for example. You know, you think about the activism that went along with the music. Sam Cooke, Bob Dylan. Um, there was there was a social, psychological, and sexual kind of catapulting into another place. Jimi Hendrix. Um, there was real change happening. I mean, there's real change happening now in our society, but it's all backwards. We're going back to the Stone Age. And
Well, I mean, I just think it's sort of funny because it's like a lot being in that in between area. You know, I was born in 1968. And so a lot of the stuff that, you know, I listened to, you know, and I've mentioned before on the podcast, Blondie, the Ramones, um, a lot of those bands. And it was sort of, I guess you could say it was sort of like you know, I wouldn't put it like that, like the 60s or like that from that point of view. I think it was just, to me, it was more about like the 50s in a way. That's the way at
Mhm.
least I looked at it. Because to
Yeah.
me, when I saw like the Sex Pistols, or, well, I didn't, the first time I heard about it, I never heard, I didn't hear the Sex Pistols until they had already broken up and were gone, 1984. But I do remember in 77, I came home, I was in third grade, and someone had told me about the Sex Pistols at school, and I mentioned it, and my parents flipped out. Because I was, you know, like 8 years old and talking about the Sex Pistols. In fact, they
That's
asked,
pretty funny.
I remember, I think it was my dad, it might have been my dad, but he said, "Do you know what a Sex Pistol means? Do you know what that means?" And I'm like, "No." But it's like, but it
That
was
is
really
so
weird
funny.
because it was sort of like I grew up very conservatively, and my parents did not pay attention. You know, they weren't like hovering like a lot of parents, you know, are today, hovering all the time. Thank
Mhm.
God. But, you know, if something was brought to their attention, then they really did pay attention and say, you know what, you can't do that or whatever, you know. But they got caught up in this whole like culture thing. Like we had the PMRC, you know, the labeling thing where they put the labels on music.
Yeah.
Remember when they said that if you listen to Ozzy, you were gonna worship Satan and all that stuff
Yeah, there was that. I mean,
and all
there's
that.
just such a history of that
I
throughout
know, but I
rock and
mean, that
roll.
whole point, I guess, sort of, I guess that's where we took from the 1950s, or at least maybe I did. And I felt like, you know, and looking back now, I would say punk really did sort of just take that basic, you know, Eddie Cochran type thing, amplify it, and sort of, you know, it was sort of lived out that way. But that's the way I looked at it, sort of as, you know, I want to be cool with my black leather jacket, and I'm going to hang out across the street from school, and smoke my cigarettes, laugh at the people going to pep rallies. It was just like a form of rebellion. And but now when I look back on it, a lot of the bands that I really did love, I didn't experience. You know what I mean? I
Mhm.
didn't like, I never really, I did see the Stones. Thank God the Stones, I was able to see them. I did see the Sex Pistols when they got back together, but I never got a chance to see like the Beatles or Elvis. Well, not many people did, but
Right.
um,
I never saw the Beatles, but I did see
you were there
George
for Ed
Harrison.
Sullivan. You saw it on like happen.
That's true.
That
That was
that
a
is
happen.
something.
That is something. But
Yeah.
I did see John Lennon in concert. Um,
Wow.
Unfortunately, Yoko Ono was there too.
Hey, well, you know what well, when I first came to New York in 2002, I was going
Mhm.
in, I forget, someone invited me to some fashion thing or whatever. And Yoko Ono was going in right before me. And I stepped outside and I had to call my mom. I said, "Oh my God, I'm here," and she's going. What is it about that though that Beatles fans really do sort of have some, at least, have some sort of you know
Thing about her.
animosity or something about her? And what did she do?
Well, that's not what I felt, but here I am seeing John Lennon, and John Lennon would do a song, and
Uh,
then freaking Yoko Ono would do a song, and I don't know what you call what she did. I don't know. I don't think you'd call it singing. I mean, she would just she'd screech. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was performance art. So
well, you know
it's
what?
just true.
Do you ever see that? Speaking of performance art, and this is sort of, I'm going all over the place here, but do you remember that uh, the original Batman in the 1960s,
Yes.
and Cesar Romero as the Joker, and he enters as the Joker. He enters a contest, the Gotham Art Contest, and all the other painters paint their paintings, right? And he doesn't paint anything, and they say, "What is it?" And he says, it's called the death of the bat mole or something. And he says it symbolizes the emptiness. And no, the girl, yeah, the socialite, she says, "Oh my God, I see it. It symbolizes the emptiness of modern living." So I guess anyway, that's my side thing on performance art. But what was that?
Right.
I mean, why is it that there's so much
Animosity towards her.
yeah.
I'm not sure. I think a lot of people saw her, and I have no idea whether there's any truth to this or not, but I think a lot of people saw her as the wedge that, initially or eventually broke up the Beatles. I'm not sure that's true at all. I've actually seen all four Beatles. Okay.
Really?
I saw John Lennon in concert at Madison Square Garden, and I had great seats. I was down on the floor. I don't remember how much I paid to a scalper. I wasn't even, I wasn't that old even. Um, One of the greatest concerts I ever saw was the concert for Bangladesh in 1970. Have you heard of that? Are you aware of that?
No.
It was like huge typhoon in Bangladesh, and Ravi Shankar called his friend George Harrison and said, can you do something? And they put together a concert to raise money for aid to Bangladesh. So Ravi Shankar performed, which is someone I never would have seen otherwise. It was pretty amazing. And then you had George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, Bob Dylan. Um, did I say Leon Russell?
No, you didn't.
And Leon Russell.
Wow.
So it's just incredible to see all these people in one place. But the most incredible scene was Dylan did Just Like a Woman, harmonizing on stage with Leon Russell and George Harrison. So together they did Just Like a Woman. And that's just mind blowing. I mean, it sticks in my mind. I can see it right now as I talk to you. So that was a mind blowing concert and experience. And I'm sure the music is out there. You can find it. I actually still have the vinyl album of the concert for Bangladesh.
Wow.
Um,
Cool.
and I should add, if we're going to go into stories, I went through hell to get it because I went down, in those days we didn't have Ticketron, we didn't have this StubHub or whatever. You went down and waited online for tickets. So when we heard this concert was going to happen, we went online the day before, like the afternoon of one day, to be first online the next morning. And so, of course, we're waiting online. How old was I? I don't know. I think it was like 17 or 18. And people are passing around bottles of apple dapple wine or Boone's Farm apple wine. I don't remember what it was. And we're guzzling this on a hot afternoon. Then people are passing joints around. And then it started to get dark. And one by one, my friend said, "Hey, I think I'm going to go home. I think I'm going, can you get the tickets?" So I had all the money in my shoe because I didn't know what was going to happen. I had all the money in my shoe, which then was probably only about 150, 160 bucks, but that was a lot of money back then. And then I just passed out, in this crowd on the line because I drinking, smoking, heat, whatever. At midnight, I suddenly feel people walking on me, and I wake up. And at midnight, they open the box office because the line was so huge. And I'm like out of it, waiting online, and all of a sudden, you'd see the line kind of open up because someone else passed out, and cops would come in and pull the person out who had just passed out. And I was literally standing on my tippy toes to get air, just to breathe while I waited on this line. But I made it to the front of the line. They only let you get 4 tickets. So I couldn't get everyone tickets, but I got someone to get me an extra 2. And that's how I got the tickets for that show. So that in itself was an adventure, but it was an amazing concert. And Paul McCartney, and I'm sure I told you this story, but Paul McCartney, I didn't see in concert. Paul McCartney, I was walking down the street in Manhattan, somewhere in the 40s. I think it was like 48th Street, maybe it's 50th Street. And I'm walking down the street, and all of a sudden, I see this guy walking towards me. No one around him at all, just walking all by himself. I'm saying this is around the year 2000 or so. And he's with a very attractive young woman who must have been his wife at the time. And I say, is that? And as he walks closer and closer, and then he walks right by me. I mean, I was 3 feet away from him. I said, wow. And then this other guy was walking, and he stopped and looked. And I looked at him. I said, yep. I said, that's him.
Yeah.
And he just walked right by me. But, someone with that kind of celebrity in New York City can walk down the street and people won't harass them. People won't bother them. They could be. And I think that's why a lot of celebrities like being in New York, because they can just be and not be hassled, which is kind of a nice thing. Yeah. But I saw the Stones in concert.
Which one did you? Which album did you see? Which tour was it?
It was a tour after, I can't think of the name of the album, but their big hit off of it was Tumbling Dice.
Oh God, I'm forgetting. I saw them for the Bridges to Babylon tour.
I think it was either I think it was 1973.
Wow. Was that Go To?
19...
It can't be Go Ted Soup, right?
I don't think so.
No, hold on. I'll find out right now.
You look like you're in a hotel. Are you in a hotel room?
I'm in an undisclosed location. Oh, I am such, now I really deserve, I deserve scorn. Exile on Main Street. Oh my God.
Exile on Main Street, right.
Oh my God. That is like
so,
really.
Okay, so it's 1973. it's 1973, and this guy Leslie, who is a good friend of mine, who I mentioned, is with me, and we're at Madison Square Garden, and we're in seats, we're floor seats, so we're right we're right on the floor. And if you can imagine, Stevie Wonder was the opening act,
Wow.
and no one even cared much about Stevie Wonder because everyone was waiting for the Stones, but Stevie Wonder was the opening act. And all of a sudden, the lights go on for the Stones, and Leslie grabs me because I guess at the time I didn't know people like rush the stage, and we rushed the stage, and there was a barrier before the stage. So there's a barrier, and then there was about 5 feet, and then the stage. We were belly up against the barrier. So we were like 5 feet from the Stones to watch them perform in concert. And it was just an extraordinary experience. And that night when I got home, my head was pounding from the sound, from being that close with that sound system blasting at you. But that was an incredible scene. Someone we left out is Joe Cocker. I mean, I saw him at the Garden too. Joe Cocker was like, he was just extraordinary. Although by the time I saw him, his voice was kind of going. That was a tough voice to sing with. No, he was just amazing, though. I mean, Joe Cocker was
What about
really.
Simon and Garfunkel?
Oh my gosh, yeah, Simon and Garfunkel. How can you not love Simon and Garfunkel? I mean, Paul Simon is one of those other guys who reinvented himself so many times and took music to so many different genres. So, of course, I loved all of his early classic works, but I saw him in concert. The sad thing is I was supposed to see him a year or two ago, which may have been his last concert, which he did in his hometown of Forest Hills at Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. And I had tickets to go with my beloved Victoria. But I had a work gig in Florida that I had to go to. So I had to give my ticket away to her friend.
Oh,
but I saw Paul Simon in concert in Carnegie Hall.
wow.
In I'm gonna guess 1975, 4 or 5, and he was there with the Jesse Dixie Singers and Urubamba, and he just did. It was like a 3-hour show. He had an intermission. He just did an incredible array. I mean, from genre to genre, from period to period, and one of the songs that stays with me the most from Paul Simon, which he performed at this concert, is a song called American Tune, which I'm pretty sure he also played at Jimmy Carter's inauguration. And it's a song that really resonates today. My eyes could clearly see the Statue of Liberty sailing away to sea. So it was quite a moving song, and it's so resonant today. Someone should dig that up because that's a great song. I saw Dylan in concert probably half a dozen times. The best, well, of course, I saw him at the concert for Bangladesh, which was incredible. And I always found that when you saw Dylan, he could either be great or at least, I didn't find him that great. I saw him with the band, which is a real treat to see him with the band. But it just seemed to me he was just shouting and shouting. I mean, it just didn't resonate for me. But I saw him when he did the, what was that called? What did he call that concert tour? But it was after he came out with that hit with Hurricane Carter on the song Hurricane.
Yeah.
The something review was that I saw him at, gosh, what did they call that concert hall on Broadway in the 70s? Um, that was the album Desire had just come out. His album Desire. The Rolling Thunder Review. That's what it was. The
Okay,
Rolling Thunder
yeah.
Review. And he came out and he did the whole concert in whiteface, which I still don't understand why. And he had an interview from the from jail at some point with Hurricane Carter during the concert, which was quite amazing. And that was just an extraordinary concert in every which way.
It's really funny that you talk about Dylan in terms of the whole shouting thing and not being able. Did you ever see Tracy Ullman when she does the Queen, Her Royal Majesty?
No.
And
I mean, I know Tracy Ullman, and yeah.
Anyway, she has this great bit, where she has famous people, and she, of course, as the Queen or Her Royal Majesty, they're introduced to her. And so they have one where Bob Dylan is brought, and before anything is said, of course it's not, it's just a setup, but
right.
She says, as Her Royal Majesty says, "I never understood a word that you ever said." So I don't know. I guess there is a lot of truth in comedy, right? Now that just hearing you say that, I sort of.
Well, that was at that one concert. I mean, when I saw him at the Rolling Thunder Review, you can hear every word. I mean, he did a lot of acoustic music with backup though, with a band. And there was a great violinist who played on that album and also played in that concert. I can't think of her name. I think it's Scarlett something.
Now, see, he's another artist whose fans, they have these things, and maybe the press sort of blows it up as well, like that. Oh, the moment that Dylan went electric. Isn't that a thing or something like that?
It is a thing. Yeah, but it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Do you know the story of that?
I know. I think I do, but it's just something that sort of, I was never into Bob Dylan. I mean, I like some of his songs, but that really wasn't sort of my thing. But anyway, I'll let you elaborate on that. You go ahead. I just thought, it's one of those things like the Yoko Ono thing. You know what I mean? These things that for years and years and years. And whenever you read any music publication or book or some expert writing about something, they will always bring up, oh, the moment that Dylan went electric, like the world ended or something like that.
Well, the thing about Dylan is he grew up with a foot in each camp. He wanted to be Woody Guthrie and he wanted to be Elvis Presley, and he always saw himself as a rock and roller, even though he was this, incredible folk singer. And that's really his roots. But the legend has it, and Pete Seeger denies it to this day. I don't know if Pete Seeger's still alive, but denied it for many years. But Dylan was the star at the Newport Folk Festival for several years running because he became such a huge phenomenon. And I think he did a set of acoustic, and then he came out for the next set and started doing electric. And I don't know what song it was. I think it's Maggie's Farm he started doing. I don't want to work on Maggie's Farm no more. And Pete Seeger was backstage, and as legend goes, he became so infuriated that he went and got like a fire axe that was there for emergencies and was trying to chop the cables to to break this thing up. And he was had to be held back. He had to be restrained. So I don't know if that's true. I don't know if Dylan was ever invited back to the Newport Folk Festival, but and people, as as an artist or performer, when you have a following and you have an audience, and at that time, the separation between folk and rock and roll, and between being like authentic and being, just out there for the commercialization, those were like dyed in the wool, really tight lines. So to have an audience like that and make the decision that you're going to do what you want to do, you're not going to be pigeonholed, and you're going to break that paradigm, is pretty bold. And that's something he did, and by doing it, I think he changed music completely. He opened the doors for people to do all kinds of things. Um, and that was the same era that Like a Rolling Stone came out, that he recorded and released Like a Rolling Stone. And that song alone was revolutionary because nobody played a song that long on the radio. I think it was over 4 minutes long. So besides the lyrics of it and the music and how they combined, but just what he was doing in music was setting a path intellectually, musically, that so many people were able to walk through that door and follow him and do just and have so much more flexibility and latitude in what they were doing. It was really quite amazing. I don't know that people realize that, to this day, how
Well, it's
revolutionary
very
he was.
it's very emotional for people. I mean,
Mhm.
you can see that in terms of, I would say, critics who you lose their objectivity because Dylan went electric, that way back
Mhm.
when. And it's just one of those controversies that, at the end of the day, really nobody really understands. But everybody will
Right.
go back to, for some reason, like the whole Yoko Ono thing. People will still go back to that and claim, that she broke up the Beatles or something like that. So that's pretty
Right.
interesting. It's pretty interesting that about the whole. Now I understand why it is emotional. If he grabbed an
Mhm.
axe at the Newport Folk Fest.
It was to a lot of people. It was like, and I don't know why they couldn't get this, but
Like a
to a lot of people,
betrayal.
it was like he was a traitor. It was like, it was that powerful. It was like he was a traitor against his own nation, where what he was an artist expanding his art and opening up all kinds of new directions.
Well, that was
So,
sort of like that sort of continued on, I think, in a different way. Like, for instance, when I was in high school and, basically it was metal out in Los Angeles. It was metal.
mhm,
There were people who were still into punk and the Sex Pistols and a lot of, and, X, the band X in Los Angeles was happening. But it's funny, certain people you could say now in your group, whatever group you were in high school, you could say, oh, these are our bands. But we cannot say now, if you happen to like a song by Journey, you could not say that you like that song,
mhm,
or if you were into punk, you couldn't say, oh, I like this Aussie song, because they were the stoners. It was sort of like the Fast Times at Ridgemont High thing with Sean
mhm.
Penn. So the heavy metal people were there, and, or the new wave people. But it sort of seems like, I mean, just from, all of those things, the Dylan,
Yeah,
the audience, in terms of who could say what. And Steve Jones, it's funny, from the Sex Pistols, not too long ago, said that, oh, I liked everything. I did like Journey. I did like Boston. I did like, this song or that, but I could not say it then.
yeah, and I don't know if this is kind of generationally. Um, I don't know if this is generationally different, or if it's, and I think there's something of the East Coast West Coast difference. Is that I don't think anybody felt quite that way, when I was growing up that I can think of. There was this kind of, though, I don't want to call it aloofness, but kind of, there are those people like bubblegum music or, like really sweet pop. And that was kind of looked down on by people who like, serious music like the Stones and the Doors and Dylan.
Yeah,
And
well,
that
I
kind
mean,
of
that
stuff.
whole thing really continued on, in terms of, who was really serious and who was not serious, and who sucked and who didn't suck. And and it's sort of funny because when I went into junior high school, and this was fall of 1980, Led Zeppelin shirts were, that was the thing that people wore to school. That had a lot of stock. But it's sort of interesting to me that all the bands that you're talking about, whether artists, whether it's Dylan, the Stones, well, the Stones, of course, because the Stones are still here. And I mean, it's amazing to me that out of everybody, I don't know if you remember when Guns N' Roses said they were going to destroy the Stones and they were old people and all this stuff. And everybody who has said that has like fallen, they have all fallen, and the Stones are all the only ones left. Keith
And they're
Richards,
still alive, amazingly.
yeah. I mean, it's like Keith Richards is still standing.
I know. It's extraordinary, right?
So hey, Iggy Pop too. So, but that is really cool. I was going to ask, it's another thing. Of course, this is much more public, but the Joan Baez song "Diamonds and Rust," and that whole thing as well, that was sort of played out, I guess you could say, in music and in the press, with Bob Dylan in terms of him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. You always hope that someone really, really talented is going to emerge on the scene no matter what. But that doesn't necessarily happen. And Joan Baez, who's phenomenally popular at that time, really, really broke Bob Dylan onto the music scene. I mean, she brought him. She put him on stage with her, in her concerts. And that's how he became known. And then he became a way bigger phenomenon than she was. And of course they were lovers and
Oh
whatever.
yeah. No, but I mean, it's just sort of like like the electric moment when Dylan went electric, and then you have the Joan Baez thing, and of course, she wrote that great song "Diamonds and Rust." I don't know. Have you ever heard Judas Priest do it? The metal band.
Probably, but it doesn't connect at the
They
moment.
did a real. I mean, well, they did a heavy metal version, but recently, a few years ago, Rob Halford and the whole band, they did their acoustic version, an amazing acoustic version of the song. So, I mean, that's funny enough. That's where I first.
And
It's sort of interesting how songs come to you. You know what I mean?
it's true. It's very true. And I can't, a couple of people who just, absolutely, I got to mention is one is Richie Havens, who is just a great folk artist who did a lot of versions, a lot of renditions of Dylan songs. And the thing with Richie Havens is that about 3 or 4 times I had tickets to go see Richie Havens, and something absolutely critical in my life happened and I wasn't able to see him. So I never got to see him live. I was going to see him at the Bottom Line, which is a small club, in the village. Yeah. And I mean, and it's just a shame that I never saw him. And then one day, and this is the kind of guy Richie Havens was, because I've heard stories from friends who have met him. One day I'm walking down 59th Street, just off of 3rd Avenue, and who emerges out of a doorway is Richie Havens in a full-length dashiki, walking down the street. And my face just lit up. I said, Richie, man, Richie, I'm your biggest fan. Glad to meet you. And I put out my hand, and he put his huge hand out. We shook hands, and he had this big smile on his face, of course, with no teeth in the front, as he as he was, and he just went walking along. But that was great. And the other guy who's just unique is Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
As a songwriter, as a poet, just unique, haunting, haunting stuff. So those guys, absolutely.
Did you ever get to see Peter, Paul, and Mary?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Did you ever get to see Peter, Paul, and Mary?
Never got to see them. No.
I have a little sort of interesting story with them. I
will say this. I used to, back in the 70s when I worked in this restaurant on the Upper East Side, coffee shop restaurant, I used to serve lunch to Peter Yarrow and his mom.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Wow. That was one of the first records actually that I ever got via my dad. My dad had a client whose daughter unfortunately had committed suicide. And so he gave all the records to my dad, and my dad gave them to me. And Peter, Paul, and Mary, what was it? I think it was A Song Will Rise, that album. And so I had all these records to listen to. That was wonderful. One of the records with the, and I always loved them. I always thought that Mary Travers had such, I think Mary Travers, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And she just had, the voice of an angel. If you listen to some of their records, not only their debut album, but A Song Will Rise, that album, and several of their other subsequent records, they're just, her voice combined with Peter Yarrow and
oh yeah, they're really quite
they're just, and Paul what is it, Stuckey or something like that?
I don't recall.
Anyway, but they're amazing. To me, they sort of exemplify that whole 60s thing that you talk about.
Yes and no, because when their music became popular, when they did the pop version of some of the Dylan songs, they were kind of condemned as sellouts or whatever.
Really?
So yeah.
So you see there's what I'm getting to. When you read things in the press, like, I was not there, but I read stuff in the press, or you read stuff in music periodicals or books. It's sort of put forward that Peter, Paul, and Mary. You know what I mean? Maybe that's just my impression, but I always got that feeling. Or when I thought of them on one hand, and then, of course, the whole California thing of Jefferson Airplane and, White Rabbit and Surrealistic Pillow. And I love
different music, really different music, but also different, in different times. Peter, Paul, and Mary were like early 60s.
Yeah.
To me, they were totally genuine people doing great music, and authentic, really authentic.
But that's how, to me, it's funny how the story changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
You know what
Sure.
I mean? In terms of, well, you were there and you remember it one way and how it was, and then how, all these other people write about it and look back on it. And it's just funny how that sort of goes. I guess it's how legends are made, right?
I suppose.
Or maybe what is it? As long as someone's still telling your story, even no matter, as long as they spell your name right.
I guess we could say that about, about the Bible as well, but
Well, maybe, but I mean, I just think it's sort of just about music, in terms of like the scene and you know, Cream magazine, Rolling
mhm,
Stone, all
mhm,
that stuff. To me, it was sort of like a lot of the stuff I read in there, like, when I'm talking about Peter, Paul, and Mary, and I thought one way about it. And then, you were there and you talk about what was really going on and how people looked at it then.
well, when you say I was there, I wasn't exactly
Well,
roadies
I
on
don't
the
mean,
tour.
yeah, but I mean, you were a young kid. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You were a young kid and you were in that time, that era. So
Mhm,
you could hear what their impressions were of that
true.
music and how that music was actually received. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
But
right
I think what,
now you'll have an album they'll say, oh, it's a classic album and all this other stuff about it, right? But if you go
right.
back to a lot of those albums, like you talk about going on searches, which people had to do, which people, I mean, now it cracks me up, when people talk, Spotify and all, which is great. But I will say there was something like for me, all the records that I loved, like Lust for Life by Iggy Pop, or bands that I found through other bands and
Mhm,
reading Cream magazine and all these music periodicals, I had to go find those records. And a lot of times those
mhm.
records weren't in print anymore. People, if you say today, oh, that record's not in print, they'd be like, what do you mean not in print? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or a record that's hard to find. And I just think that, now people will talk about it one way. Like when I found Less for Life, I found it in a store in Long Beach, California, and I spent $200 for the vinyl copy, right? And then I think it
Wow.
was like 2 weeks later, this was the 90s or something like that, I think. But anyway, then they did some reissue on CD of it. I mean, I have the vinyl thing, but I just think it was much more of a personal thing because you really did have to go out and look. And a lot of the stuff that I really liked, or like for instance, my mom when she would play those songs, my mom loved the Phil Spector stuff. Like the
Mhm.
He's a Rebel and the Shangri-Las, Leader of the Pack. So my early
Right.
experiences were really, and that book Rock Dreams by Guy Pilliard and Nick Cohen, which is a great book. I don't know if I ever have I showed you that.
No.
Never showed it. I'll have to show it to you sometime. My copy. It's out of print, but the guy Guy Pilliard, he's the French artist that did David Bowie's Diamond Dogs album cover. I
Mhm,
think could be wrong, but
mhm,
anyway, he does these elaborate uh, drawings of each artist from like starting with Frank Sinatra and it ends with Lou Reed, the early 70s. And basically Nick Cohen writes a caption under each drawing of what the artist represented. Like like Donovan, he has
mhm.
Donovan in sort of like a clown thing sitting on top of a hill, and it says "the fool on the hill." That's what he called it.
Oh.
Or then he have
That
uh,
was a guy who was really beat on somehow,
really
Donovan. Yeah, he was really kind of looked down on as a wannabe or something. I don't know. I mean, his music was sweet. It was nice stuff. So I don't know why people were so down on him.
so he, but that, well, then that makes sense now why I always knew Donovan as the guy who sang that song "Catch the Wind," try and catch the wind,
Yeah, it's a
whatever,
beautiful
and
song.
beautiful. And I always loved that song, and I liked his voice. But in that book, you have all of that, and you have. I'll have to
Mm.
show it too because there's two drawings of. I think there's two things of Dylan in there, and they talk of one here. One of him is a hobo. He's
Mhm.
depicted as a hobo, and then I think they did bring up one of some other controversy involving between him and his fans. But the book is really great. But they had that whole thing, which the part they call the teen dreams, which I love, and they
Mm.
had the motorcycle accident. and the girl, going, and the cops are there, and what does he say? Of all the teen dreams, this was the most tragic.
Mm.
Three
Yeah.
girls in black leather jackets singing of tragedy, and deaths were a dime a dozen.
I don't know why this rings this bell off, but you probably know this. I don't know how many people remember this. Dylan was almost killed in a motorcycle accident.
No, I don't know.
And he was almost killed in a motorcycle accident. He was completely out of commission for about a year. And I think this was in the late 60s, I'm going to guess. And then I think his first album after that was New Morning, which kind of makes sense.
No, it's like when someone comes out of rehab, right? Oh, it's a new morning. I'm a new person.
That song was a big hit. It was a fairly big hit. Not a huge hit, but it's a fairly big hit. Yeah. You mentioned, I'm going to show you something now because I realized as I look into the screen, it's in the background here. But when I first started going out with Victoria, I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah.
And she found out that I was a Dylan fan. For my first birthday, she got me this numbered print from 1983. And he's in Manhattan on the West Side somewhere. And he just looks happy, just looking up at the sky. And I told her she was crazy because I can't imagine how much money she spent on that.
Well, Bob Dylan stuff and Bob Dylan fans are like they're over the top. They really are. Well, I mean, for an idea about someone going electric for how many years?
Well, no, I don't think that's the idea. I mean,
it's very personal. It's like when people write about it, it's not like, oh, well, he decided to go electric. It's almost like you can see the emotion coming off the page, when people write about it.
Right. But I think it's more, I mean, for me, that's not the big deal. The big deal is his work. I mean, his music, and more importantly, his lyrics. I mean, the man, is just, extraordinary. What sound like simple songs that are so intricate in their lyrical work. Even a song like I Want You, it just sounds like bum, 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 I want you. But then if you really look at the lyrics, I mean, it's pure poetry. Sad-eyed lady of the lowlands, stuck inside a mobile with the Memphis blues again, Desolation Row. I mean, just extraordinary lyrical work that very, very few artists can,
Do you like Elvis?
Hold a candle to.
Did you like Elvis?
Elvis?
Yeah.
Elvis Costello or Elvis?
No, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
I was aware of him. I liked him, but there was no big deal for me. Sorry for anyone out there that might offend, but talk about people who are huge fans. I mean, Elvis fans are a whole other thing.
Yeah, that is very true. I always love Elvis. I thought he had a great voice, but not only that, he really, to me, he set the pathway. The pathway was created for the rock star. And not only, just everything about him, even the idea of him is like,
well, in a way, he was also a social phenomenon.
Yeah. I would say so.
Like the Beatles.
Yeah, but he didn't, how can I put it? To me, the whole idea of rock and roll rebellion, like if you look at some of the early, posters or things that have come out in recent, I shouldn't say from back then, but now, you often see like James Dean, Elvis Presley, and Marlon Brando, you know, like their image in The Wild One with Brando, you know, the motorcycle gang thing, and of course, Rebel Without a Cause. And
Sal Mineo.
yeah, well, those things were like, I guess it was all part of the whole idea of rock and roll, of rebellion. And to me, it's like the teen dreams that I heard, like in those songs, like The Leader of the Pack and
Right.
Oh, He's a Rebel, Darlene Love, you know, and the Crystals, all those songs, I really that was the idea. And I think that was the idea that the punks took. You know, they went back beyond the 60s and that whole when Beatles, you know, were hanging out with what's his name in India or whatever. And they got back to the basics, you know, and even if you look at whether you're looking at the Sex Pistols or the Runaways, who sang about teenagers' lives. And that was, I guess, the thing. Maybe it was my parents who actually, in their own way, they didn't realize it, but they sort of created that whole mythology for me. You know, with my mom playing those, you know, the Crystals and, you know, just like the teen, Eddie Cochran, Summertime Blues. That whole idea of like, oh, you know, I'm at school. School is a drag. I can't wait to get out of here. We're going to go up to Hollywood and hang out. And that type of idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you know, rock and roll was always about rebellion.
Yeah. But I mean, the 60s was sort of like a different thing. Like you talk about, you know, the social impact of like Dylan and people like that. Whereas rock and roll, I think between, you know, the 50s and then you go to the 60s and how the Beatles went from I Want to Hold Your Hand to, you know, they're really far out stuff that they were doing later on. And other bands, you know, as well went that whole route. It's sort of funny too, when I got into one of the things I was talking about in one of the previous podcasts I had just recently did was the Kinks. And did you ever like the Kinks?
Yes.
I really love them. And you know, the interesting thing is they don't get the credit they deserve. They really
it's interesting.
don't, you know, because
it's really interesting because I love the Kinks. And yet, you know, and yet in thinking about this stuff, they didn't even pop into my mind.
Yeah, but because sort of like in America, well, I know they had a band. They had a touring band. I think it was from 64 to like 66. They did not, there was a whole period that they were not able to come to the United States and tour. And they finally came back, I think in 68, 69, 70, but everything had changed. You know, it went from like, you know, they were doing I'm Not Like Everybody Else and some of that other stuff. And then, you know, you go to the 70s with what they were doing and, you know, they were moving forward too, but I think that their audience had sort of moved on and maybe the Beatles, you know, had taken some of their audience or I don't know, or maybe they overshadowed them. But all I know is that I think it was 1996, you know, when Ray Davies did Storytellers. And I saw that on VH1 and I had only, you know, I knew about You Really Got Me because of Van Halen, of course, their great cover. And I knew Well Respected Man and all that
Lola.
stuff. But Well Respected Man.
No, I know. And Lola.
Oh yeah, but that was later on. Yeah, that just came out again. They just reissued that. But he did all these songs like Sunny Afternoon and A Dead End Street. And then I went out and bought this compilation. And if you listen to their songs, I mean, they have great songs. great
Oh yeah.
songs. And it's like they really don't. I mean, if you look at where the Beatles are and where they are, I mean, just in terms of public perception in America, and there's not a lot of people that know about them. I mean, a lot of the
Yeah,
punks
it's
do
true.
because a lot of people cover it. And I did myself, I did every I'm Not Like Everybody Else. I love that song, but they really are that's one band that I have been going back to again and just sort of going through uh
And when you think of a band that didn't, in a lot of ways, did not change, in a good way, did not change, always stayed with their roots, is the Rolling Stones. It
yeah,
was always rock and roll with, and blues,
yeah.
and
Oh, the
that's what they
Stones
started
are just
off.
like they are godhead. I love Mother's Little. I love their early work, Mother's Little Helper,
Oh
and
yeah,
all that stuff they did.
Satisfaction,
Yeah, Let It Bleed. I love that
right?
song.
Yeah,
I
Give Me
love most of the
Shelter. I
stuff
mean,
on Goat's Head
just
Soup. And you know, it's really interesting. A lot of stuff I was introduced to through reading a magazine and when artists would talk about bands they were into. Like I
mhm,
didn't know about, for instance, the British glitter music scene, you know, with Mark Bolan and T-Rex and
mhm.
Gary Glitter and Susie Quattro. But when I was reading, I was really into Joan Jett. I love rock and roll. And she talked about all these bands. And then I went out and bought those records. When I was listening to Susie and the Banshees, who had put out an album in 1987 through the Looking Glass, I heard The Passenger. And then I found out that that was Iggy Pop's song. So I went back and got all of Iggy's albums. So there was always something for me that I was going back to. And I loved, I, it's sort of weird for me that way that all the bands that I've really, really loved, I've found way after the fact. And I've had to go
Right. Well,
back.
that happens. Yeah, that happens. That
Well,
happens.
it's sort of like being in the, what is it they say? You could be in the right place, but the wrong time. And that is sort of like, I think has been my thing.
Listening to you talk about all this, it pops into my mind that I wish you could have a conversation with my friend Leslie, who I spoke about earlier, the guy with 500 record albums. Unfortunately, Leslie died at the young age of 23 from kidney disease.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was buried with his electric guitar in his coffin with him.
Oh,
But it was just so tragic, you know?
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. But nobody knew more at that time. I didn't know anybody he was like an encyclopedia of music. I mean, because that's what he did. Listen, I mean, all day long, practically listen to the radio, play records, go and buy records, turn everyone on to different music and different artists.
Marshall, that was, I mean, that is my whole point with sort of, I guess you could say, this podcast and so many things all go back to how cool it was to go on New Release Tuesday, go to the record store and find and meet other people who would tell you about great music. You know, I mean, now you can find it online, and that's cool. I'm not trying to sound like an old person talking back in the day, but I really do think that there's something not only, I think it's not only relevant, but I think there's something intellectually, I don't know the word, but being curious, having
Mm-hmm.
curiosity, not having everything done for you. And
Well,
here's
but
the album. I'm going to go out
that's
and I'm going to find this. I'm going to go to a record convention and find, like with the Runaways. You could not find a Runaways record anywhere except the best of the Runaways. This was after Joan Jett became huge, right? With I Love Rock and
mm-hmm,
Roll. I had to
mm-hmm.
go and find and look and through tons of records and use vinyl and all of that stuff. But I think that when you have all of it, and that it's great to have access to, I believe me, I love that. But I think that there is something to that. And I think that whole, like you talking about seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, that is really important. How was it really like? What was it really like? Because, you know, you have these articles, you have these so-called experts who come in and say, oh, you know, this is the way it was. But a lot of times, yeah, it was that way, and it's true. But I think it gives you a sense of a time period and a place and what it meant. And I know that when I'm thinking about the music that has resonated with me, or I think back to it, or I think about something that my parents played, it's sort of like, okay, yeah, that is sort of like, it's sort of like breadcrumbs across time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, you know, to a very great extent, music is who we are. And many different, it's who we are as human beings. It's who we are in that era. It's the history of the society and the politics and the culture of its time. And often it's music that's like making the trail for the future and making room for people to be who they are.
Right.
It's, you know, it's enormous. It's an enormous part of who we are as a human race.
Yeah. I just think you're right about that. You really are. I think that time and space and people are different people in different times and in different places. And I think that's why there's so many people, you know, like whether you're talking about Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, those who left, you know, very young at 27, and they always come to represent that time and that place because that's the way they are. They become frozen in time.
Right.
You know,
Sure.
and but I do miss that. I really do miss that idea. And I think that's really something that's being lost today is the idea of being mentally curious and like, oh my God, I want to go and find out about that. And oh my God, I was in the store and I met this person and they turned me on to this great album. And it was about people. You know, I mean, music is not about a computer. I mean, it's great. Like I said, I know I'm sounding like an old person. But I mean that contact of, you know, being able to say, hey, you know what, this is really cool. Or like you were talking about, you know, being in line for tickets. I mean, I can remember going to a noontime K-Rock show in 1987 with my friend Dave from high school. We went up to see Joan Jett play at Chuck Landis's Country Club in Reseda in the Valley. And we got up at like probably 3:30 in the morning. And we drove out there and there was a line because it was a free show, right? And in that line, even though everyone was dead tired, everyone was like, oh my God, you know, do you have this bootleg? Oh, do you have this? Hey, man, you know, it was really just like this. It was just like this other world, you know? And it's
But,
like,
know, that's a really, what you're putting your finger on is a huge change in society that people who are growing up now are, you know, they're just not going to experience walking into a record shop and being curious and flipping through the albums and seeing, oh, I didn't know this album existed, or who's this band or whatever. Or for that matter, you know, you talk about waiting on lines. I remember when a new movie came out and you wanted to see it, you'd wait online for 2 hours to see the movie, to get tickets. But on that line, there were people, there were jugglers, there were magicians, there were people starting conversations. And, you know, this whole this whole part of humanity is lost. Talk about curiosity, walking into a bookstore and just flipping through a book and, you know, being exposed to something you might not have been exposed to. It's not the same doing it on the web.
No,
Not at
it's
all.
not. It's not. And I think that's why I'm really glad, you know, to be able to talk to you about, I mean, you were there for the Exile on Main Street. That is like that album. If you talk to anybody, and I can't believe I didn't remember that Tumbling Dice was on that album, but I mean, Exile on Main Street, that is the album. I mean, I have friends who would say, you know, you are not rock and roll if you have not listened to Exile on Main Street. You are not rock and roll. There is no way you can be. And I just think that, yeah, I think it's important. And I guess, to me, it was just so exciting and it was so much fun, you know? And I guess from one point of view, and I hate to say it, but I guess from one point of view, I am sort of disappointed in a way a lot of that stuff worked out. You know what I mean? It's like, even now, when I see people like kids who are like best friends or something with their parents, or their parents are hanging out, and I'm like, why would you do that? You know, I mean, I'm like, where is your rebellion? It's like if my parents, I was going to school and my parents said, "Oh, you look good," I knew I had to go home and change immediately. You know, it's like, where's that Elvis? Where is that? You know, or looking at Billy Idol. You know, Billy Idol was just so. I mean, when I saw that album, his debut album and White Wedding, and you know, it was just, it was out of this world. All that stuff was, and you know, now people, it's like, oh well, I want people that look like you and me. Well, I don't want someone who looks like you and me. I want someone who's like, who I can't picture sitting down at breakfast and eating a bowl of Wheaties. If I can picture them doing that, like just being a normal person, you know, or even the way Marilyn Manson was and that controversy, and you know, or you look at an Ozzy Osbourne album, you know, Diary of a Madman. It's like, you know, and I guess maybe that whole thing with the PMRC where they were labeling albums, and that just drove me nuts. Cause like I said, my parents that just sort of put them on their radar, you know, cause they were like, what are you listening to? The most embarrassing story, I wanted to get Men. I like that song Down Under by Men at Work. I can't believe I'm telling this story publicly, but I did love that song Down Under, and I wanted to get the tape. And because of all of that crap with the PMRC, my mom went in with me to Licorice Pizza, and she asked the clerk if she could hear the record first. And I said,
"Oh my gosh,
yeah,
that is funny."
I said, let's go. I do not want to be seen with you. My stock is already falling. I will be nobody. I will be condemned and laughed at. I don't want. He said, "Don't you want the record?" I said, "No, I don't want that record."
Not that bad.
Yeah. So so I guess it sort of brought that back for me. But I think it's just awesome, you know, these, you know, and of course the Dylan stories, and you putting into context that whole, you know, the whole thing with the electric thing. Something as simple as that, because now, you know, you read about it or you read something else and it's like a press thing, and it's not really, if you weren't there in that time, you really don't know what it was really about. Because a lot of times I think some things that are written about much later are not really what they're about. They're just like continuing a storyline, and you know, we don't,
you know, you can take that into any, you know, genre of history, so to speak, because we don't really know what it's like. We take so much for granted, you know, when you see, you know, when you just see the civil rights movement in this country and what people the brutality that people went through to get rights that now people, take for granted, women's rights that people take for granted. And I'm not talking about the PC police. I'm talking about, that for many years I worked with ASCAP. I worked for ASCAP.
Mm.
The managing director for many years at ASCAP was a woman by the name of Gloria Messenger. Gloria Messenger, I'm going to say probably around early 70s, graduated from Yale Law. I think she was third in her class from Yale Law School. She came to New York. She lived in New York, and she went looking for a job as a lawyer. Third in her class, Yale Law School. Nobody would offer her a job as a lawyer. They offered her jobs as a secretary. This is a woman of great accomplishment. The only place, to their credit, that offered her a job as a lawyer was ASCAP.
Yeah.
And she built a career there and became managing director, which in essence is CEO of the organization.
What was it like for you at ASCAP in terms of being around all that music and the business side of things?
Well, I was very much on the business side of things, not on the creative side or working with the creatives. But the business side was very important. As I mentioned to you, well, first of all, what people don't realize is, or maybe they do, but that there's always an attempt to exploit artists. And a lot of what I did in my career at ASCAP was really what you're doing is you're defending the creative rights of music creators. That's what you're doing at ASCAP. And I was very much involved in some of the antitrust suits against ASCAP by, it's so ironic that these huge broadcaster megaliths, like, ABC Cap Cities and NBC Universal and this was back before they were Cap Cities or Universal, but these huge organizations sort of position ASCAP as a Goliath when ASCAP is like a tiny speck of sand compared to them, and then seek to avoid paying or to minimize the payment of money for music. And I was very much involved on the television side, and the antitrust suits by huge television organizations against ASCAP, in which, in essence, they wanted to be able to just swoop in and say to the composer, "Hey, either you're going to take what I'm going to give you, or I'm going to, or forget it. I'm going to take your music off the air." And so there was it was a constant battle between ASCAP and these huge corporate entities that was ongoing. And so, and these, these suits can go on for years at a time, and it's just so costly and so demanding to defend against them. So it was fascinating being part of it. One of the creative parts that I was very involved with was the creation of the ASCAP I Create Music EXPO, which is a conference that goes on in LA once a year. I suppose it wasn't done this year because of the pandemic, but once a year, in which, and I was there at the creation of this, as part of the creation of this, where we bring together, a who's who of the music industry: publishers, composers, songwriters, unbelievable array of people. And then, struggling songwriters and composers who want to become, the next generation, come there and pay really a minimal amount to go to workshops to see these people speak about their careers. You have Academy Award winning composers in a small group workshop breaking down for these people, okay, this is what I did with the music, here's what was going on in the action, here's how I composed the music. Or having, rock artists, songwriters, where the wannabes will come and submit their music ahead of time, and they'll be selected out, and they'll break down their songs and say, well, here's what you got to do with this, here's what you got to do with that, and why. One-on-one meetings with publishers and people, from the labels and whatever, just this extraordinary 3-day conference. And I had the great privilege of being part of the origination of that, which the first one I think was 2006, and it still continues on. So that was very exciting. But a lot of the times I was on the business side of it, protecting the rights, churning out the payments for it. ASCAP, everything that comes in to ASCAP revenue-wise goes out to the songwriters, composers, and publishers, except for the cost of operating the organization. So it was a privilege to be part of it. There's always going to be frustrations working.
Yeah. Well, I think that the industry, and this is one thing I think I've learned, there's certain stories that go on through time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is, the big bad industry against the artist. And one thing I've noticed, though, in just in terms of my thinking, is that, well, you have these labels, right, that pour an exorbitant amount of money into projects that they don't know will ever recoup money back.
Absolutely.
The question comes back to when people talk about how terrible they are, which they've done for years. But the interesting thing is, in spite of all of that, malice towards labels, I've never met a musician who didn't want to be on a major label. And
sure.
And I just think that you really have to become nuanced in your ideas. Early in my career, I worked with a noted producer, Arthur Wright, worked with some great people. And I don't think that, there's always this thing in the press, right, about, what this person's doing, or what this label's doing, or what this organization is doing. But I don't think that there's enough really nuance. I think it's become like a legend in some aspect. But then on the other hand, there are real cases like the whole payola thing in the 80s, I think, which
I think it was the 50s.
The radio. I think that was
50s,
that
60s, 1950s.
Really? But there was a thing in the 80s, though, where there was the suit.
I think
there was a big suit in the 80s. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm remembering.
But it's interesting you talk about the labels, because a lot of focus goes there. But working for ASCAP is not working. You're not a middleman with the labels. You're representing the songwriters and composers with those in the performance right, which is a huge part of income for the songwriters and composers and the publishers, which is that when the music is performed on radio, on television, on cable, in arenas, in bars, in restaurants, wherever, that's your property. As a music creator, that's your property. And if someone's using your property, there should be a payment for it. And, it always stuck in my mind, especially when we were fighting this big antitrust suit back in the 80s and into the early 90s, that there was one lawyer for the other side being the, ABC, NBC, CBS, who owned and operated stations, who would get up in court and say, a single needle drop of music generates a fee to ASCAP, like this outrageous thing. But as time went on, and they were able, and neuroscience as a field grew, what they're able to establish is that a single needle drop of music creates a cascade of cognitive energy and flow of within the brain is just extraordinary. So music is so powerful. And you think about it, you can hear a single needle drop of music and it creates this emotional force and it brings you back to a time and a place in your life. That's how powerful music is.
Yeah, that's, I just think it's sort of, how can I put it? I think the industry is really complex, and there hasn't been enough to really break it down in a way that is really nuanced. The whole idea, like I said, whether you're talking about performing rights, organizations, or you're talking about record labels, or even now the whole idea of, oh, wow, the internet is going to level the playing field, and, oh, Spotify, now, of course, you have the conflicts between Spotify and Apple Music and what they're paying. So I sort of think that's sort of like a age-old battle that'll go on to the end of time. There will always be something, but I think if you really look at, like you said, music is really, you really can't place a monetary value on it. But then, of course, it depends upon who's listening to the music and how it resonates with them. But you have some great stories, Marshall. Great stories, and I appreciate you taking some time to share that with the audience. And what you have to do now, though. You know what you have to do. What you do have to do. You have to put together a playlist.
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
So you're gonna have to pick. Well, it can be as many songs as you want, and that comes out with this podcast.
Okay, I'll get that to you for sure. It's going to be a lot of old music.
Well, hey, see, you really can't call it old.
True. I agree.
Yeah, because music, now I'll really put on the bullshit mode and say, music is timeless, right?
But it is. It really is.
It really is. I think that you can't, people, oh, well, what's the difference between now and then? I mean, and I have sort of expanded the types of music I've listened to, whether it be opera or things that are outside of my preference, of course, for rock and roll. But I think that it is invaluable, and I think the stories around it are invaluable, especially now. Where there is no there may be some intellectual curiosity, but it's more, I think, driven by, other people, rather than saying, okay, I'm listening to this and wow, this is really cool, and I want to check this out, or, so hopefully maybe someone will go out and check out Exile on Main Street or Bob Dylan.
Right. And, that's what I was going to say. Maybe someone will listen to something that touches something in them, and it's music that they were never in touch with before, and it suddenly springs springs something forth. So you say depends on whether or not it resonates, depends on who's listening to it. But one thing we know for sure, it resonates. It's going to resonate differently for everyone, but it resonates, and that's the power of music.
It will with somebody.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of fun, Eddie.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Marshall.
Well, thanks for inviting me on.
I appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
And whoever's listening to this should appreciate you for doing this, because it's just great stuff to be out there. So
I appreciate that, but I mean, it's really, to me, if you are a musician, whether you're not a musician, it's really about being a fan. You know, I mean, that is what really propels people. I mean, for me, it was in terms of wanting to play an instrument, it was because, wow, I saw that. And that is, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to make those sounds. Or, you know, if you're going through a specific time in your life and, you know, certain songs resonate. So I appreciate your time.
Cool.
All
well,
right.
Thanks a lot, Eddie.
All right. I expect that playlist.
Okay, you'll get it. Stay in touch, man.
I will.
Okay, bye-bye.
What you want me to be. The darkness will turn to light. I'm your dirty secret tonight. Dream or not and take a look inside.
Thank you for listening, liking, and sharing my podcast. Eddie Starr's College of Rock and Roll Knowledge is a production of Ton Up Incorporated. Copyright 2020 Ton Up Incorporated.